Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett,
And I'm Sabrina.
and today in our 464th episode, we've got a bunch of news which is on a theme. It's all about dinosaur teeth.
I know in the last episode we said we were going to cover a new dinosaur, but there were just too many good teeth stories, so we're pushing that until next episode, the new dinosaur.
Yes, and we also have an interview with Brian Eng. Talking to him is always awesome because he not only has a bunch of experience as a paleo artist, but he also gets out in the field and does a lot of work and videography work out there. So it's always cool to get the updates on what he's been up to.
Oh, yeah. Plus, he's got some very cool projects in the works. He always does.
Yep. We also have a dinosaur of the day, and this week it's Eoabelisaurus. And of course, we have a fun fact, which is about where butterflies come from a little bit.
Oh.
Because they sort of dawned around the same time as Eoabelisaurus, which means dawn something. I know that much of the Latin, at least.
Don Abel's lizard.
There we go. But before we get into all of that, as always, we like to thank some of our patrons. We don't have any new patrons to thank this week, but we have 10 patrons who've been supporting us. And they are Amato Titan, Ayrton and Everett, Reed, Trev, Lou, Paul B, Travis, John, Samanchasaurus, and Jurassic Jim.
Yay! Thank you so much, fellow Dino-it-alls. We really appreciate all of your support. And we also appreciate you sticking with us. I know a lot of our patrons have been our patrons for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing.
Jumping into the news all about dinosaur teeth. I'll start with a paper that talks about how a tooth shows that Tyrannosaurus probably lived in what is now Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too surprising because we have fossils from sort of north and south of it.
Yeah, but this is the first known dinosaur fossil found in Yellowstone National Park.
Cool.
This was published by John Paul, Michael Hodnett, and others, and available on ResearchGate. So Yellowstone National Park, of course, is in Wyoming. This fossil was found back in 1966 by U.S. Geological Survey geologists. Specifically, they found it in the Harebell Formation. It's one shed theropod tooth, and it comes from the late Cretaceous. It was known as a quote-unquote dinodont dinosaur. G. Edward Lewis said that it came from a carnivorous dinosaur and referred it to the family Dinodontidae.
That sounds familiar, Dinodontidae, but I can't place what it is.
You might be thinking of Dinodon, which is a dubious tyrannosaurid.
Yep, that'd be it.
Yep, and that name means terrible tooth.
Okay, so they were trying to assign it to the family that included Dinodon.
Right.
But obviously that's not a thing anymore.
Yeah, because Dinodon was named based on teeth found in the Judith River Formation and described by Joseph Leidy in 1856. But in 1970, Dale Russell rejected Dinodontidae in favor of Tyrannosauridae, quote, due to the lack of diagnostic material for Dinodontidae, which makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's probably analogous to Tyrannosauridae. And that's a lot easier to figure out what dinosaurs are in it than Dinodontidae.
Yes. Well, this tooth has been referred to as the, quote, miserable reptile tooth, end quote. That's in a letter from J.D. Love, who headed the expedition that found the tooth. He wrote it to Edward Lewis, and he wrote, quote, thanks very much for all the work you did on my miserable reptile tooth. I'm sorry that we couldn't have gotten more and better material. Nevertheless, your identification is quite significant, for as far as I know, this is the first dinosaur fragment to have come from Yellowstone Park, end quote.
So it sounds like miserable in that it wasn't in great shape.
Or that there just weren't any other fossils to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's a synonym for the terrible tooth, because Dinodon means terrible tooth. I don't know.
Terrible, miserable.
Yeah.
Sort of. Related.
So this tooth had been at the USGS Museum collection, but kind of forgotten about, the U.S. Geological Survey collection. But then it was rediscovered during a resource inventory that happened when that collection became part of the Smithsonian Paleobiology collections in 2021. It got transferred, so then it was rediscovered.
They did a fair amount of reclaiming of stuff around then, because they also got the tyrannosaur from the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman.
Mm.
And it changed from, what was it, Wankel Rex to
the
the nation's T-Rex.
Yeah. Well, it made sense for their new exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
So this tooth is now known to belong to a tyrannosaur. That's based on details in the serrations and the size of the tooth. It's considered to be a juvenile CF Tyrannosaurus sp, so unknown species.
Of Tyrannosaurus?
Yes.
That's interesting, because there's only one species of Tyrannosaurus, according to most people.
Yeah, but maybe not according to these authors.
They're going with maybe the Regina and Imperator hypothesis.
They didn't get into that.
Yeah.
Other than what they're considering this tooth to be.
Mm-hmm.
They said it's got features of tyrannosaurid teeth, but not of a particular type of tyrannosaur. So the author said that they're basing it on our current understanding of how tyrannosaurs were distributed in the late Cretaceous in what's now North America. And in 2004, Carr and Williamson reviewed all small late Maastrichtian tyrannosaur specimens from Western North America, and they found them to all represent various growth stages of Tyrannosaurus. So based on that, it seems probable that this tooth is from a juvenile Tyrannosaurus.
Gotcha. It's a pretty good deduction there.
Mm-hmm.
If there's Tyrannosaurus all over the place at that point in time and nothing else that really had that kind of teeth, good guess that it's probably from a Tyrannosaurus.
Yeah, and this would further expand Tyrannosaurus's range in North America. It's also possible that there's more dinosaurs to be found in the Harebell Formation in Yellowstone, which would be cool.
Mm-hmm.
Our next paper about teeth has to do with a collection of teeth in the UK that shows that Maniraptorans were around about 30 million years earlier than we previously thought.
That's a lot earlier.
Yes. This was published by Simon Wills and others in Papers in Paleontology, and it's open access. Maniraptorans, really quickly, they're the group that includes birds and non-avian dinosaurs, including the dromaeosaurs/raptors like Velociraptor, but also troodons, oviraptors, and therizinosaurs. And they're known mostly from the Cretaceous. But ghost lineages from phylogenetic analyses show that they likely started in the Middle Jurassic. As the authors wrote, quote, however, the Jurassic Maniraptoran record is frustratingly incomplete, end quote.
Is Archaeopteryx a Maniraptoran?
Yes, I believe so.
I know that is one of those early birds, because that's the name, that has a long ghost lineage after it. So that makes sense, because that one's basically middle, late Jurassic.
Mm-hmm.
So that means there's stuff going way earlier than Archaeopteryx even now.
And with ghost lineages, that just means we haven't found those fossils yet that links this group together throughout time.
Yeah, basically just a gap in the fossil record. Because you assume there was something there. But until you find it, it's a ghost, I guess.
Yeah. So for this study, the team used machine learning on a collection of teeth, and they found that Maniraptorans spread out across the world before Pangea split. They looked at isolated theropod teeth from 4 Middle Jurassic localities in the UK. It was the Wood Eden Quarry, the Kirtlington Quarry, the Hornsleigh Sow Quarry, and Watton Cliff. And those quarries are from Oxfordshire, Gloucestershire, and Dorset. The teeth were collected over several decades from different museums, and most of the teeth now are in the collections of the Natural History Museum in London. So to do this with the machine learning, they trained 3 models using a large data set of dinosaur tooth measurements that included thousands of teeth. Because with machine learning, you have to have large training sets so that it knows what it's looking for when you're doing the actual study.
Mm-hmm.
And then they made 3D models of each tooth from those 4 UK localities from CT scans, and then used the models after they were trained to look at them, and they combined the results of the 3 models to identify each tooth. And they found that the teeth came from dromaeosaurs, Troodontidae, and Therizinosauridae. The teeth are the only troodontid and therizinosaur fossils found in the UK so far, and it's the oldest evidence of them in the world. And based on where the teeth were found, this extends Therizinosauridae and Troodontidae by 27 million years, and it extends Dromaeosaurs by 38 million years.
Okay, I see. So Troodontids being that much earlier and Dromaeosaurids being that much earlier extends the Maniraptorans.
Yes. Well, Therizinosaurs are also Maniraptorans.
Oh, they are? Weird.
Yeah.
Weirdos.
So I was just it's kind of an average. 27, 38, 30.
Gotcha.
But pretty cool that you can tell more specifically what types of dinosaurs these teeth belong to and date them.
I guess the only potential issue here is we're sort of assuming that when we're training the computer based on these different known teeth, that those are all the groups that the teeth could be assigned to. If there's a new type of dinosaur that's not a therizinosaur or a troodontid or a dromaeosaur or any other known family, but all this machine learning algorithm has ever known are those different categories, it has to put it into one of them.
Right.
So if it's a new type of dinosaur,
you retrain it and run the models again.
Yeah, and it would continue to get better, but you can never really specifically rely on that sort of analysis. The only thing that's really pretty bulletproof is if you have the tooth and it precisely matches another tooth and you know what that tooth is from.
I see this as one of those laying the groundwork kind of things.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you can use machine learning in these cool ways to kind of expand what we already know.
It definitely gives you an idea about what the teeth are probably from. Just sort of have to verify it after the fact, I think.
Next in our tooth tour, there was a tooth that shows that there are more spinosaurs in the early Cretaceous in what's now England. This was published by Chris Barker and others in PeerJ, which is also open access. There are a lot of isolated teeth found in the Wealden supergroup of southern England from the early Cretaceous. The teeth were thought to be from baryonyx.
That's what they assigned pretty much all spinosaurid remains from the Wealden group to for a long time.
Yes, but more recently, lots of spinosaurs have been described from the area, so it's likely that not all those teeth came from baryonyx.
Yep.
For this study, they tested one tooth, HASMG G369A.
Interesting specimen number.
The A is because it came from a collection of teeth known as HASMG G369. So this is the first tooth in that collection.
Number A.
And this one was found in East Sussex. It's, quote, among the oldest spinosaurid material known from the UK. Now, spinosaurid teeth, they're known for being cone-shaped and based on ridges and the texture of its enamel. That's how you can tell it apart from crocodilian and other theropod teeth.
They are really recognizable once you see a few of them. Because they're sort of very long, but they sort of have a little bit more of a blunted end on them. And then, yeah, that carinae or the serration ridge that runs down the sides is just very recognizable.
Yeah. This collection was gifted by the Reverend Pierre Teilhard de Chardin to the Hastings Museum. And when the team examined and analyzed the tooth, they found it to be from about 132 to 139 million years ago. They also found that while this tooth belonged to a spinosaurid, it did not come from baryonyx. And that just further helps show the diversity of spinosaurs in this area.
It makes sense that that wouldn't be from baryonyx because that is significantly older than baryonyx. I think the estimates are more like 130 million years on the old end for baryonyx. So if this was at least 132 million years old, then sizable gap there, millions of years.
Yes.
It's always possible there was a baryonyx species dating back that far, and it could happen with, lumping of species names into one genus. But other than that, yeah, it's probably not going to be baryonyx.
Seems less likely since things have been being split lately.
I've also noticed that when spinosaurid teeth are for sale, they're almost always just labeled a Spinosaurus tooth. And every time I see that, I'm like, Is it really Spinosaurus, though? Is that just the most recognizable Spinosaur name that you can get the highest price for? Because if you wrote baryonyx, people wouldn't pay as much.
Or maybe they meant to say Spinosaur tooth.
Yeah, it could be.
Sometimes it's hard to not add that extra US
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the dinosaur name. Well, this last thing is about teeth, not a tooth.
News about teeth.
That's not as fun to say. For this study, teeth show that there was a diverse theropod community living in what's now southern Chile up until the KPG extinction event. This was published by Sarah Davis and others in the Journal of South American Earth Sciences. And they found that there were new, previously unknown theropod dinosaurs from the late Cretaceous, 66 to 75 million years ago, found in Chile in the Rio de las Chinas Valley in the Magallanes Austral Basin. The paper said they're, quote, the southernmost occurrence of several theropod clades outside of Antarctica, including Megaraptorids, Unalagians, and Antiornithines and Ornithorines, end quote. And just to quickly recap, Megaraptors are known for their large hand claws.
Mm-hmm.
Unalagians, they were feathered and carnivorous.
Basically the dromaeosaurs of the southern hemisphere.
Yes. And the other two groups are birds.
We don't need to worry about them. Too bird-like.
We do talk about birds a fair amount on this show. But
it's true.
They said these are, quote, the first records of theropods from Chilean Patagonia, end quote. So these avian and non-avian theropod fossils were found over 60 degrees south.
That is far down there.
Mm-hmm. Some of the farthest south, unless you include Antarctica, as they said.
Mm-hmm.
They're mostly fragments that were found. They found part of a shin bone, parts of shoulders, part of a foot, and lots of teeth. In one of the articles I read, it said the enamel glint helped them find the teeth while excavating.
That's useful.
Mm-hmm. And this helped show a, quote, diverse theropod community, end quote, that lived until the asteroid hit. So it kind of goes back into that debate about whether dinosaurs were in decline before the asteroid hit.
They weren't. I know I say that every time.
Yeah.
Just depends on how you look at it. If you look at a specific group, sure, there were some that were. And maybe overall, they might have been sort of at a bit of a plateau. But it's not like they were going to go extinct anyway if it wasn't for the asteroid. They were doing a lot better than that.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, pretty cool. All of these teeth show us more diversity in dinosaurs and also solve some mysteries because one of the collections, I think the machine learning collection, for example, they didn't really know what kind of teeth specifically it was, and now we have a better idea.
Mm-hmm.
Felt like I forgot to explain how there was a mystery solved involved, and that's the one.
It's always good to solve mysteries. There's a couple of these were in collections for a while, with people not knowing what they came from and then it being figured out.
Yep.
And in just a moment, we'll get on to our interview with Brian Eng. But first, we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. And now on to our interview with Brian Eng. But of course, we have an extended version of this interview for all of our patrons. So if you are a patron, you might want to go check that out. And if you're not a patron, you could consider joining and get access to that extended interview and many, many, many more pieces of premium content, over 100 pieces of premium content.
Wow, we've built up a collection.
Yep. What we lack in dinosaur fossils collected, we make up for in audio recordings collected.
All right.
We're joined this week by Brian Eng, who's a paleo artist and creator of the documentary series Jurassic Reimagined. And if his name sounds familiar, he's been on our show a couple of times because he is always bringing some amazing stories about being in the field as well as making art and videos and all sorts of awesome stuff. So thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Hey, no problem. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And we know you're always working on tons of projects. But first, we got to ask, what's going on with Jurassic Reimagined?
That is a very fair question because fully 3 years since I released part one. And I released part one. I knew it was a little premature because I wasn't done with the subsequent parts, but I didn't realize at the time how premature it was. And I kind of rushed that part out because we found some cool dinosaurs in saltwash member of the Morrison Formation, which is down in the lower layers of the Morrison, where not very much stuff has been found. And my collaborators, Rebecca Hunt Foster, John Foster, Matt Wadle, who I've been exploring in the Morrison with for quite some time now, they really wanted to get a press release out and make their supporters and donors at their museums happy with the work that we've been doing. Because at that point, we'd already spent like 4 or 5 field seasons looking in the Morrison. They got funding from the Friends group of the Utah Fieldhouse Museum to fund digging up what turned out to be a 6'7" long Brachiosaurus humerus.
Oh,
Nice.
That's amazing.
So that stuff is all we kind of let that story out early. My original plan for Jurassic Reimagined was to basically make it all about digging up the Brachiosaurus humerus with a little bit of information about the ecology of the Morrison Formation. Some of the neat finds we've made, they give us some clues about how this insane ecology with all these giant animals living together actually might have functioned, what supported that ecology, how many of these animals actually live together in the same ecospaces, how long did they live together through Morrison time. We wanted to kind of touch on that while kind of focusing on the Brachiosaurus dig. If we kind of dug into the research a little more, we could make a documentary that actually presents some new perspectives based on research that was in the works, as well as stuff that had been published, but not actually articulated or synthesized to answer questions like, okay, what's the maximum diversity of giant long-necked dinosaurs that we know of in the Morrison Formation? Like, how many genuses or species can we actually say live together, or even families? Like, if we go really broad with it, like, which quarry in the Morrison Formation has the most abundance of giant animals? And then where are we finding the small animals? Where are we finding the plants and other organisms that indicate what's going on in the environment? How does that relate to the famous giant dinosaurs? Those are questions that John and Rebecca had some feelings about from years and years of experience in the field, but we wanted to dig into the literature and also get some more radiometric dates and sample some more sites to kind of clarify that whole paleoecological picture.
Yeah.
And so that ended up being several years of work in order to really flesh out the documentary. And during those years of research and re-editing the documentary and reconsidering what images and art and perspectives we wanted to focus on, new stuff kept getting found in the Morrison. So now, in the 3 years since part one came out, there have been a whole bunch of new sites discovered by Rebecca and John and their collaborators at the Utah Fieldhouse. A guy named Dale Gray has found a bunch of really important sites. There's been new research done on the palynology and plant life. We've dug up more plants. We've clarified some of the interesting features of the stratigraphy and the change through time in the Morrison. We're looking at climate stuff, and we found more dinosaurs too. And we actually also dug up a few other things, and some of those digs will be featured in part 3 as well. Basically, I raced to get the first part out and realized how many questions still needed to be answered. And then part 2 was almost done when part 1 came out. But then I wanted to answer these other questions, and in answering those other questions, we went back and started rewriting part 2, tightening it up, making it stronger, but also including some of these new discoveries along the way. And then in part 3, we're going to go really deep into the ecology, deeper than I think has ever been done before. We're going to synthesize more expert perspectives, both from paleontologists, but also experts who work in modern ecologies and their perspectives. And it's been really fun because I've gone out in the field and actually filmed with people who study modern ecosystems. And then I've asked them questions like, okay, if you were in this ecosystem and a 40-foot long animal moves through this ecospace, how do you think that would affect X, Y, and Z? And got these really interesting perspectives of experts from different fields imagining what would happen in those cases and how that would change the ecosystem to have like multiple species of giant plant-eating animals living in that ecospace, along with all these different plants and invertebrates and small animals. And so then as I've been doing that, I've also been creating art, and we've also been upping the quality of animation in Jurassic Reimagined. So right now I'm working with a team of 5 or 6 artists at any given time, artists and animators, and we're trying to make like much higher quality animation utilizing my 2D illustrations.
Mm-hmm.
And so the project has really evolved into not like a slight step up in quality from my previous YouTube videos, but really to like one of those big kind of life projects where you invest a bunch of years into it, you make it as good as you absolutely can in the hopes that it kind of stands the test of time. And hopefully, my hope is that it serves as a waypoint, sort of like to say, okay, after 150 years, well, over 150 years of studying this formation, here's where people who have studied it the most are at with their understanding of it. And here's what questions are still kind of like gnawing at them.
Yeah, that's always the best stuff, because everything changes in science, especially paleontology, because you dig up one new bone and it can change quite a bit. But yeah, I agree with you. The best thing you can be is sort of a landmark of the state of the science at this point in time. So when you mentioned that you had found some new dinosaurs, are they new species or are they just new like bones?
That's a good question, actually. So that's one of the things that looking at the stratigraphy and the radiometric dating of the Morrison is going to help us clarify in the years to come. So the coolest thing that we found, and that we've already mentioned, and there's been blog posts and a little press release about it, was this Brachiosaurus humerus that we found down low in the Morrison. One of the things that looking at the stratigraphy and the change through time in the Morrison is going to help us to clarify is, okay, how far apart in time are the different groups or the different genuses or species of animals? How far apart in time and space actually are they? If we're calling them all the same thing, it'd be a good idea to know actually when these different morphs were showing up. So for example, and this is actually in the literature already, but the Apatosaurus that are found at the Mygat Moor Quarry, which is the quarry that the Dinosaur Journey Museum in Western Colorado digs at pretty much every summer. They actually have a citizen science like pay to dig program where you can go and dig in the Mygat Moor Quarry. Most of the sauropod material that's come out of that quarry is from a species of Apatosaurus. When you look at all the Apatosauruses across the Morrison, and you look at the ones that come from quarries that we have dates from, there's some interesting patterns because there is some morphological variation between some of the animals have been referred to Apatosaurus, some of them have been referred to Brontosaurus. But like when you look at, for example, the ones at the Mygat Moor Quarry, they've been called Apatosaurus louisei, or like sometimes people write CF, meaning it's like not certain if it's exactly this, but we're referring it to this species. But Apatosaurus louisei, the original holotype specimen, the specimen that name is attached to, comes from the Carnegie Quarry. And we now know that the Carnegie Quarry is fully 1 million years younger than the Mygat Moor Quarry. And so when we look at the Mygat Moor Quarry Apatosaurus, John Foster and colleagues mentioned this in their 2018 paper on the stuff from the Mygat Moor Quarry. They realized, like, okay, of all the animals we've named, this one is closest to Apatosaurus louisei, but it's not exactly the same. So some paleontologists would be inclined to give it a new name. I think John's perspective is that he's tired of all the names, and John feels like the sauropods are at least a little bit oversplit, in part because researchers have been a little premature in naming things because we haven't had good constraints on how old each quarry is. And as we're starting to sort that out, we're starting to see some interesting patterns. Suffice it to say, we're still getting a handle on what is reasonable to call a new species in the Morrison Formation, and looking at that's basically trying to get more timestamps for each layer of rock is really important for us to be able to kind of characterize how these animals were evolving and which of them actually lived at the same time as each other.
Well, the Morrison Formation, what is it, almost 10 million years long? Something like that.
It's at least 7. There's a couple different radiometric isotopes that can be used for dating, and they give different variances in sort of like the range of times they give for a given quarry. But if you take the oldest possible date from the Morrison and the youngest possible date, you can stretch it to close to 9 million years, but the better constrained dates are between 7 and 8.
Okay. Yeah, because that would be crazy long for a species, because species are usually more like 2 million. So you're going to, like you said, those different layers, you're going to have totally different animals in each layer. They're not going to meet each other at the opposite ends of the Morrison.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the surprising things that we find in the Morrison is that, and this will be one of the things that we're going to show in Jurassic Reimagined Part 2, with all the new stuff we found, as well as with stuff that's been historically known about, but we haven't had good radiometric dates for it. One of the things we're going to show is how many lineages survive for how long. And that's one of the big research efforts. Basically, I've been working with John and Kelly Trujillo. Kelly Trujillo is a geologist and paleontologist who's been working with a guy named Kevin Chamberlain at University of Wyoming, and they've been getting more and more precise radiometric dates for the Morrison. They've been developing techniques for dating the volcanic ash that fell into the Morrison Basin. And I've been working with them and John, who's made these extensive lists of every animal that's been found in all of the main quarries in the Morrison. And I've basically been building these, basically cross-referencing the dated quarries with the known animals from those quarries and quarries that are close enough nearby that we can say that these are within a close time range. And so when you do that across the formation, it's actually one of the really surprising things is how long-lived the main members of the ecosystem actually are.
Nice.
And we'll get into that in more detail and with lots of cool art and graphics to make it a little bit clearer. But one of the really surprising things is when you start getting radiometric dates, you realize that a quarry that's high in the formation in one area isn't necessarily younger than a quarry that's a bit lower in another part of the formation, because it hasn't all been deposited in the same topographic setting. And then subsequent to that, there's been mountain building, right? So when you're exploring the Morrison, you might explore a few miles of outcrop, and then there's a big fault and hills from another formation pushed up through the layers, right? So then if you walk over those hills, okay, we're in the Cretaceous now. You walk over some Cretaceous hills, and you get to the Morrison on the other side of that little uplift. It doesn't always look exactly the same because it was deposited by rivers and floodplains and swamps. These things that even a river can make a lot of topography as it's eroding down through different layers. It's cutting away and redepositing those sediments elsewhere, while the floodplain on either side of that river might be developing much more slowly. So you might have a river that's cruising along for thousands of years. Gradually, it's eating down through the floodplain on either side, but it's also depositing sand in the bottom of the river several meters lower than the floodplain. If you imagine a river, often you'll see a steep bank on either side of the river. So that is going to create some variation in topography that's actually really important for how we interpret stratigraphy. And then when rivers are really big and powerful and carrying a lot of sediment, say from volcanic highlands that are dumping bunches of volcanic ash all of a sudden from big volcanic explosion, you can get these river systems that'll be, they'll just be cruising along, maybe making a few layers of sand every as each year goes by, they're adding a few millimeters, a few centimeters, maybe even a few feet of sand. But then you'll get a big flood event and you'll get 2 meters of sand deposited in 1 year, right? And then that river will chill out and just be cruising its course. And that flood event may deposit 2 meters of sand in one area and 5 centimeters of silt on the floodplain. And then it'll go back to its normal non-flooding situation. And so you have to imagine this complex changing landscape where things are happening on the landscape at all different speeds, right? And so then you got to get, part of the reason you need radiometric dates is because we don't actually know for sure how much topography there was in that landscape. And as we're getting more data and people are doing more detailed stratigraphic measurements and really looking at all the layers of rock, it's actually looking like what we thought of as the Morrison Basin, like this one big giant floodplain that covered the whole middle of North America, wasn't totally flat. There was almost certainly, well, actually, there was certainly moments during the development of this huge depositional system. There was times when there was hills that may have been several hundred feet in elevation change. There was areas where we find in some of the river deposits in the Morrison, we find good-sized cobblestones. Up to some of them, like John says he's seen ones that are up to about the size of a football, which that's the kind of thing that you see in usually a river that's eroding through some hard bedrock, and it's making like those big cobbly pebbles that you see like in a mountain stream or in the foothills regions. And some of those cobblestones are actually made of granite, which comes from volcanic magma that's been coming up slowly and forming, like the Sierra Nevada mountains in California are formed of granite. It's magma that didn't erupt in an explosive volcano. It slowly rose through the layers of rock, and it cooled slowly and forms this crystalline granite structure. There's granite cobbles in some of the Morrison rivers, and those granites can be traced back to what are called the ancestral Rocky Mountains. So the very beginnings of the Rocky Mountains were pushing up through parts of Colorado, and possibly even there's Kelly Trujillo might not even want me to say this, but she's seen some granitic cobbles in Wyoming as well. So there's a possibility that the beginning of the Rocky Mountain ranges and the Laramie ranges, some of those early foothills and the sort of the first extrusions of granite that formed those now massive mountain ranges were starting to pop up during Morrison time.
Oh, wow.
Cool.
Which to me is fascinating, right? Because it's like we're dramatically altering this whole landscape.
Yeah.
And so then when you start thinking about, how animals moved across this landscape, how different ecospaces would have formed, how climate and geology and animal and plant ecology all are interacting in this really complex way, you start to get like, it's dizzying how much complexity there is, right?
Yeah.
It's like we've been really going in deep and trying to zero in on like, okay, so what are some things we can say about this ecospace and about this formation that haven't been said before and that are solid and supported by evidence? And from my perspective, obviously I'm super biased. I'm an artist. So I also want to like depict the things that look really cool. Fortunately, like the fossil record is full of really cool stuff that can be depicted. And then subsequent to that is like the documentary doesn't like, we haven't figured out everything. One of the points of the documentary is to get to those questions where it's like, okay, how many of these animals live together? Where did they come from? How did they evolve? How did they change through time in the Morrison? Can we see that in any specimens? How did the ecosystem change through time? How did the climate and geology, how did that affect the ecospace? And we have this tremendous amount of data, and the way that scientific publications are set up, it's difficult or maybe impossible to write a single like scientific paper that synthesizes all this stuff. Art and documentary filmmaking and also John's book Jurassic West are ways that we can pull together over a century of research and try and synthesize it, and then hopefully get to okay, what's the next step?
You pull it together, but you also make it accessible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the great thing, because it's like a lot of times you're trying to figure out when did this dinosaur live, and in that paper they talk about the formation, but then in order to figure out what time that is, you have to find some other geologist who's done the radiometric dating on that formation, and then in order to figure out what it lived with, you have to do the same thing again. So you have to do this with every animal, and you're doing it too in addition to that in finding the new information. And it sounds like it's messy enough that you basically are getting like radiometric datings from like every site you possibly can to piece this together, which is amazing.
Yeah. And so I'm applying the artist brain question of like, well, what did it look like to decades and decades of work by multiple different researchers. Oh man, to me, it's very personal. And that's one of the things, again, in Jurassic Imagine, I'm trying to capture with some of the art. It's like when you dig up a giant limb bone of a dinosaur, you see like individual muscle scars on it. You see vascular channels. When it cracks open, you see the marrow inside. It's like, it's kind of really, it's in a weird way, I don't know if intimate is the right word, but it's like very personal. This was a part of a living creature that like walked across the landscape, and lived for decades.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I've started to sort of change the way I talk about dinosaur specimens rather than like Brontosaurus was this. It'll be like, this Brontosaurus had this going on.
Yeah, that's one of the things that a big sort of formation-wide survey, like looking at the Morrison Formation for a number of years, does, is that it makes you realize that until we really understand the context that these things are found in, it's hard to make sweeping generalizations about a lot of them. Like, and in the Morrison Formation, one of the questions that I had was like, okay, how many Brontosauruses and Diplodocuses and Brachiosauruses and all these different cool long-necked dinosaurs and Stegosauruses, like how many of those things can be found in one hole? Because if they're found in one river channel, buried at the same time, they overlapped, right?
Yeah.
Like they lived in the same ecospace and came down to that river for some reason, when we're going to get into some of those reasons, right? But like some of those really fundamental questions were ones that was like, it's kind of hard to find a clear answer on for the Morrison Formation. And some of the discussion and debate about it would focus on one quarry or another and didn't have radiometric dating. And so like, our understanding of the fossil record is infinitely nuanced, but at its core is the story of a bunch of individuals that lived out their lives.
You mentioned bringing the animals to life. So I just want to really quick ask it, because I know you're building a Velociraptor puppet, and that seems like the ultimate bringing something to life kind of art form.
Yeah, we are. So we're building a puppet. I'm working with Yara Haridi. And unfortunately, this is another project that's gotten super delayed by the juggling of projects, but also the pandemic. So this puppet will be used for outreach, and it's going to be a handheld puppet that can move its head around and open its mouth. So I'm working on a mechanism for the arms with the goal of showing people how the movement of a velociraptor's arms is similar to the movement we see in the arms of birds. So
awesome.
One of the ideas in paleontology is that basically the motion that raptor dinosaurs were using to grab their prey basically set up the necessary joints and articulation of the arm bones that allows birds to flap their wings. So what I'm trying to do with the puppet is create a mechanism so that when the puppeteer is interacting with people, if the velociraptor gets excited and wants to like throw up a threat display or just show people its beautiful wing plumage, I'm going to make it so that they can basically pull a cord and the wings will like flip out.
Awesome.
Nice.
That's another project that's like another one where I was very humbled by how much we actually know and don't know about velociraptors. Velociraptor's been known about since I think it was published in 1929. It was really early on.
Yeah, it was in the 20s for sure.
And so when you see like a lot of paleo art or like skeletal reconstructions of Velociraptor, they'll mention like, I think it's Osborne 1929 is like the name when the name Velociraptor was coined. And so I'm like, oh, okay, I'll just go to Osborne 1829 and they'll have pictures of the real bones, right? But it turns out the holotype specimen, or the specimen that the name was based on, which is the size of animal that's perfect for making this puppet, it turns out that specimen is pretty incomplete. It's got a nice skull, most of a good skull, but not many other bones from behind the skull. So I'm like, oh, crud, like I'm trying to figure out the body proportions so that the arm will be the right size relative to the head. And so that it'll, look as realistic as we can go with it. And what I realized is that, like, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of specimens of things that are called velociraptors and not universal agreement on which ones are the same species of velociraptor, which ones actually belong in the genus Velociraptor.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I had to kind of delve into that and figure out, okay, what specimens are really complete and everybody agrees on them being velociraptors, and then how do I scale? Some of those are like more mature specimens. Like one of the best ones is the famous fighting dinosaur specimen, which is a velociraptor like locked in combat with Protoceratops. And I mean, some people have debated whether or not it's actually fighting the Protoceratops, but I mean, its arm is in its mouth and its killing claw is in its neck. So like, I don't really know how the fossil record can be better than that.
It's pretty definitive.
For showing, yeah, I mean, there was some interaction going on, right? They're not like, they didn't get jumbled that way by burial. So whether the Velociraptor was scavenging, I don't know. To me, it really looks, it's like, I don't know if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, if it sticks its killing claw into your neck like a Velociraptor.
While getting
it's probably a Velociraptor fighting something. And, I don't know. Anyway, all that is to say, that's an amazing specimen, if only for it being a completely articulated Velociraptor. But it's a large adult-sized Velociraptor. The holotype specimen that Velociraptor was named for is a bit smaller. And so just to make the puppet, I found myself going down this research rabbit hole of like trying to get all these bone measurements to figure out, okay, how much smaller should the holotype be? Like, how much smaller is its arms and legs relative to its head? Which I think I mean, for an outreach puppet, we've got close enough.
I just double checked. It was 1924, which is very
24,
close.
okay. Yeah. So yeah, you'll notice like if you look at a skeletal drawing of a Velociraptor, most people who do skeletals will like put the name of the paper that name came from next to their skeletal, but not everybody lists exactly which specimens their skeletal is based on.
Mm-hmm.
And then some skeletals don't show you which bones are actually missing or inferred from which specimens. So this is, I mean, another really famous dinosaur that this is a much bigger issue for is Spinosaurus, because you have our current idea of what Spinosaurus is based on 5 different specimens found in totally different regions, right? So, and they don't have radiometric dates, as far as I understand, from any of those. So that's a bit like, from my perspective, that's a bit like digging up parts of long-necked dinosaurs from different parts of the Morrison. And yeah, maybe they're all in the Diplodocid family, but are they all the same type of Diplodocid? And like, these animals are evolving different parts of their bodies at different rates in response to different environmental pressures and things. So I'm personally like very, very skeptical.
I'm glad to hear that, because I keep saying every time they're like, we're going to make the neotype of Spinosaurus Egypticus, this one from Morocco. I always go, but it was in Egypt, and that's not necessarily that close to Morocco. So we might be jumping the gun here a little bit. Maybe the Egypticus one in Egypt was a little different than the one, especially since they even want to go to the species level. It's like, oh, I don't know, guys.
Yeah, I personally, I don't understand. One of the great sort of cultural disconnects that I find myself up against between myself and a lot of people who are fans of paleontology and even some paleontologists is there's great reverence for dinosaur names, but those are just human hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
So if the data is suggesting that name doesn't apply to an animal, I don't know why you would, designating neotypes, you get into some sticky terrain, especially if there is substantial time difference between the different animals. Like, one that I think is going to have some interesting results down the line, and I don't mind, this is Jurassic Reimagine related again. So there's Allosaurus fragilis in the Morrison Formation, and then there's Allosaurus gymnatini, are the two named species from the Morrison Formation. So Allosaurus fragilis, or at least the specimen that bears the name, which is quite scrappy and fragmentary, is potentially pretty close in age to the holotype of gymnatini. And then what makes things really complicated is if you imagine flying across to central Utah on the western edge of the Morrison, there's an Allosaurus rich quarry at the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry.
Oh yeah, I love that one.
That one is full of Allosaurus parts. There's a paper from a few years back, I think it's from Ken Carpenter, where he looked at all the range of variation within that one quarry. So one hole in the ground that has a few years of Allosaurus is deposited in it, meaning that there was some type of a drought situation going on. Researchers like Joe Peterson, who have been studying the taphonomy, have been looking at how these carcasses might have been accumulating, and they think these things were probably floating in during flood events.
The bloat and float hypothesis is winning.
The bloat and float, yeah. And then a combination of bloat and float, but probably also animals aggregating nearby because it was a low spot that held some water during drought times.
Full of dead bodies.
Yeah, full of dead bodies at a time. But if the drought was 10 years ago and it got some dead bodies, when you first get there, the bones, there would just be bones in the bottom of a muddy pond. Yeah. So it's still potentially drinkable water, right? And then, a few of your friends die because it's pretty rough. And then you get a few more carcasses in. So anyway, point being, over the course of a very short time period, the Cleveland Lloyd dinosaur quarry accumulated a high range of variation of Allosaurus of all different sizes. Unfortunately, they're all disarticulated.
Yeah.
So you've got, in the Morrison, you've got 2 different species of Allosaurus named. They're potentially not very far apart in time. And then you've got all this depositional complexity. And one of, the Allosaurus fragilis holotype is super scrappy. It was one that was described by, I believe, Marsh.
Yeah, that's why it's fragilis, right? Because it's it's this fragile little thing.
It's so crumbly. But then, so there's a specimen now mounted at the Smithsonian. That's this beautiful specimen that they filled in some bits of the skull, but overall it's a much more complete specimen. And that one is one of the other ones dug up back in the day from the Marsh Felch quarry. And boy, to me, it looks a lot like Allosaurus Madsen. But it's, been proposed as the neotype for Allosaurus fragilis. I don't have a dog in this fight. I've just been looking at the stratigraphy and drawing the animals because I think they're cool. And man, I think as our understanding of when and where the different layers of the Morrison are actually deposited, I think that's going to kind of cause people to reassess which animals we're grouping together and which ones we're splitting apart based on the shapes of their bones, which in some individuals, in some features, especially things like head crests, there's a lot of variation in these features.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. That was a really long-winded explanation.
That was great.
It was good, though.
My skepticism.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, is there a good place for people to find you online if they want to see updates and find out when your new projects are being released and everything?
Or watch Jurassic Reimagined Part 1 if they haven't seen it yet?
Oh, thank you, guys. Yeah, so you can see the 2020 version of Jurassic Reimagined Part 1 is currently on my YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Dinosaurus Reanimated. You can also just Google Brian Ing Paleo Art or search it on YouTube. That'll take you to my YouTube channel. I'm at Brian Ing Art on Instagram and the platform formerly known as Twitter. Both of those are okay places to reach me. I have a website called don'tmesswithdinosaurs.com, but it is very old and out of date, and I'm going to be making a new website soon.
You're also on Patreon.
Oh, yeah, and I'm on Patreon. If you want to support my art directly, I'm patreon.com/historian himself, and that's where kind of all of the wild, weird stuff from my creative world, I deposit behind the scenes things that I'm working on and all kinds of fun stuff. So yeah, those are the best places to hunt me down on the web.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was always,
thank you,
it's
guys.
Always great to talk to you.
Yes, come back anytime.
All right. I'll have to, if you'll have me back when Jurassic Reimagined is finished, we can do you guys can do your Q&As because I'm sure you'll have more questions.
Oh yeah.
After
sounds good.
Seeing it. Yeah, I would love to come back. You guys are awesome. Thank you for doing this.
Awesome. Thank you for the great interview, Brian. It's always fun talking and catching up on all your work. And for our listeners, if you want to hear more about the Clydesdale sled that was used to excavate some dinosaur bones in a very impressive fashion, then check out episode 271 when we previously interviewed Brian and Matt Wadell all about that work.
Before we get into our dinosaur of the day, we're going to pause for a quick break from our sponsors. And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Eoabelisaurus, which was a request from Paleo Mike 716 via our Patreon and Discord. So thanks. It was an Abelisaur, surprise, that lived in the Middle Jurassic in what is now Chubut Province, Argentina. found in the Cañadón Asfalto Formation. It looked somewhat similar to Majungasaurus. It walked on two legs, it had a long head, a long tail, a bulky body, powerful legs, and short arms. Although, unlike Majungasaurus, no head ornamentation has been found.
It's interesting it's described as having a long head. I always think Majungasaurus and Carnotaurus and the other Abelisaurs, like one of the most notable things about them is that they have sort of a short head. Unless we're thinking long in the vertical dimension, sort of like a tall head.
In the paleo art, it looks like a long head to me. That's how I came up with that.
Gotcha. At least compared to something like Majungasaurus, I suppose. But not compared to something like a Spinosaurus.
That's a good point. Where do you draw the line on long head?
Yep.
Well, Eoabelisaurus had short neck vertebrae, and it also had 4 fingers on each hand, and of course, strong, sturdy legs. It was estimated to be up to 20 to 21 feet or 6 to 6.5 meter long, but then a later estimate found it to be 19 feet or about 5.8 meters long.
Not so big for an Abelisaur.
Yeah. It did have heavy shoulder blades.
Yeah, of course it did. Because it has to support those really powerful, super short arms.
Yes, which is what it's known for. The type and only species is Eoabelisaurus mephi. The genus name means dawn Abel's lizard, and it refers to the fact that it's an early relative of Abelisaurus. For reference, we talked about Abelisaurus back in episode 79. The species name is in honor of MEF, which is the abbreviation for the Edigio Ferruglio Museum of Paleontology, where Diego Pol, who found the fossils, is active. Diego Pol found the fossils in 2009, and Eoabelisaurus was described in 2012 by him and Oliver Raoult.
Those dinosaur names that are named based on an acronym are the ones that I have the hardest time figuring out how to pronounce. Because usually I'll go to like, well, what was the original word? Okay, I can figure out how that's pronounced and work from that. But when it's an acronym or just an abbreviation, it's like MEFI.
Oh, yeah. That's why I went to MEF.
Yeah.
MEFI.
Yeah, then you just do it how it looks because there's no right answer.
Well, the holotype of Eoabelisaurus includes a nearly complete skeleton with a skull. Yeah, of either a subadult or adult. And that means most of the spine, both arms and legs, parts of the skull. It's missing the front of the skull, lower jaw, and end of the tail. Though they did find 27 tail vertebrae.
Wow. Yeah, that's impressive.
And the back half was articulated.
Nice. That sounds like a really good find.
Yeah.
That's interesting, too, that you said it was estimated right around 20 feet, maybe a little less. But if it was a subadult, could have gotten a lot bigger.
That's true. Or at least a little bigger.
Yeah.
Eoabelisaurus was first grouped as an Abelisaurid, but then later grouped as an Abelisauroid.
Oh, so it should be Eoabelisauroidus.
That's a mouthful.
I don't know if that works with the Latin grammar.
I don't know either. But Eoabelisaurus helps show how Abelisaurs evolved. Before Eoabelisaurus, the oldest known Abelisaurids weren't well known. They were only known from fragments, and they were only definitively known from the early Cretaceous. But Eoabelisaurus helps show that Abelisaurids were around 40 million years longer or earlier than we previously thought. And as a reminder, Abelisaurids, they were bipedal, walked on 2 legs, carnivorous. They were known for their stocky legs and often the ornamentation on their skulls, like crests or horns. They had the short arms, often without wrist bones, and 4 stubby fingers on their hands. They had, you were right, Garrett, they do have short but tall skulls.
Although this one, proportionally compared to something like Carnotaurus, looks a little bit longer.
It does, yeah. And many of them had bony crests above their eyes. They live from the Middle Jurassic to the Late Cretaceous, and they've been found in Africa, South America, India, Madagascar, Portugal, and France. Abelisaurs are mostly known from the Southern Hemisphere, and they were like the tyrannosaurs of the Southern Hemisphere. Eoabelisaurs lived before Gondwana split off. It could be that there was a big desert that kept Abelisaurids from going north. And interestingly, Eoabelisaurus' arms were shorter like later abelisaurids, such as Majungasaurus. Majungasaurus lived at the end of the Cretaceous. But other abelisaurids from the early Cretaceous had longer arms.
It's ahead of its time.
Yeah. So Eoabelisaurus' upper arm was longer than the lower arm. The upper arm was actually normal in size. And that may mean that Abelisaur started evolving these shorter lower arms first before moving on to the upper arm getting shorter.
I don't know what's weirder. Either way, it's very weird.
And the short arms show that Abelisaurids started getting shorter arms early on in their evolution. Now, with its small arms, it probably used its teeth more to go after prey, and they probably had a powerful bite.
I mean, dogs get the job done with just their mouths. So this thing had a way more ferocious mouth. It probably didn't need its hands.
I was thinking crocodiles also get the job done with their jaws.
Lots of animals do just fine with impressive teeth.
Yes. Other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place as Eoabelisaurus included theropods, such as Chondroraptor, indeterminate spinosaurs, megalosaurs, and more. Also sauropods, like Patagosaurus, and ornithischians, such as the heterodontosaurid manidins. And other animals that lived around the same time and place included mollusks, insects, fish, amphibians, turtles, crocodilomorphs, pterosaurs, and mammals.
Speaking of things that dawned in the Jurassic, just as dinosaurs were rapidly evolving in the early Mesozoic, moths evolved their proboscis to deal with the harsh, arid environment.
Their proboscis, you say?
Do you know what a proboscis is?
No.
It's their long, like, tube mouth that they unfurl to drink water, and also butterflies use to drink nectar. I think it's similar as the thing that mosquitoes have to poke into you and drink. That's a proboscis.
The more you know.
Yep. Quick reminder from our fun fact in episode 448 is that they found that butterflies evolved about 100 million years ago to take advantage of flowers, and a reminder that butterflies are just a special type of moth.
They're the pretty moths.
They are. So if you're a big fan of butterflies and you don't like moths, butterflies are moths. So you should like moths. Previously, the idea was that butterflies evolved to drink nectar, and then some moths diverged with the proboscis for, other reasons, for getting liquid at night. But there's a new study that calls all of that into question. It's pretty difficult to nail down the butterfly moth family tree precisely, because there are almost 200,000 named species of moths and butterflies.
Wow.
And that's over 10 times as many as dinosaurs. Even if you include birds, if you don't include birds, it's like 100 times as many.
Wow.
But there was that paper, episode 448, if you want to get into the butterfly evolution. We talked about it there. But something I skipped over last time was how butterflies and moths that seem to have very fragile wings even fossilize in the first place.
I was just wondering, how can we name so many species, and how did they even fossilize so you could tell that they were different species?
Yeah, almost all of those named species. I think the fossilized ones are basically a rounding error. Those are almost all living today, or living very recently, where we have preserved specimens of them. But yeah, we do have fossilized moth species from just the fossil record. So both butterflies and moths are in the order Lepidoptera, and Lepidoptera means scaled wing.
Fitting.
It's got the optera, just like Archaeopteryx or pterosaur, where the P becomes silent. And then the lepid part is the part that gives you scaled, like I guess lepidosaurs. So anyway, butterflies and moths are literally covered in microscopic scales, and that's why they're called scale wings. They can have millions of these scales, and they overlap like shingles on a roof.
Wow, millions on those fairly small wings.
Yeah, they're very small for millions of scales, but they are microscopic scales. Those scales are made of chitin, and they can be colored like hairs or feathers, which is where their coloration patterns come from on both butterflies and moths. Chitin is really tough material. It's what insect exoskeletons are made of, as well as squid and octopus beaks. It was also a part of the trilobite exoskeleton. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out our I Know Paleo episode on trilobites.
Mm-hmm.
Chitin has a Mohs hardness of 7, which is the same as quartz or porcelain. So if you have a porcelain sink, that's about as hard as chitin is. It's pretty hard.
Okay, that makes more sense than for fossilization purposes.
Of course, fossilization isn't just about hardness, it's also about chemistry. Chitin is a biopolymer, meaning it has a structure like plastic, which is made up of many identical monomers linked together. And that's why they're called polymers.
Because they're made of monomers?
Yep. The individual monomers in chitin are very closely related to glucose, or maybe I should say relatively closely related. This means that chitin is chemically somewhat similar to sugar. Unsurprisingly, like glucose, chitin can be broken down by bacteria, fungus, or other microorganisms. And as another really weird aside, our immune system actually has enzymes in it that can break down chitin. And you might wonder, why do we need that? It's not for eating bugs. It's actually for situations like if small fragments of chitin get inhaled.
Oh, like through dust?
Yeah, then your body can break it down. Like a lot of those enzymes are located in the lungs for just that purpose. But outside of the human body, the decay rate of chitin varies quite a bit depending on the conditions. In freshwater, it can decay away in just a few days, but buried in saltwater sediment, the decay rate slows by a factor of 5,000. So it takes that decay rate from days to over a decade.
Wow.
A lot of wows.
Well, a lot of wow
Moments.
facts in this fun fact.
Yeah, it's sort of a series of fun facts. This means that if butterflies or moths can get buried deep enough, fast enough, in the right environment, both of them can get preserved, including their wings.
And that's how they get named.
Yes. There are many moth and butterfly wings in the fossil record, but most of them are from about the last 50 million years, or maybe even just 25 million years, so far away from the early Mesozoic. We do know that moths share a common ancestor with the caddisfly, also known as sedge flies or rail flies. I had no idea what these were, but apparently there's like almost 20,000 of these species too.
Well, moths did better than if there's 200,000 of them.
Yes, that's for sure. And I don't know that much about invertebrates, so it's definitely a blind spot for me. But these caddisflies basically look a fair amount like a moth. The scientific name for the group is Trichoptera, which means hair wing, like trichinosis and stuff, that trick.
So we have scaled wings and haired wings.
Exactly. And so Trichoptera have these little hairs where moths and butterflies have little scales. An important detail is that these caddisflies also have jaws instead of a proboscis, and we assume that their common ancestor did as well. The caddisfly fossils date all the way back to the early Triassic or even the Permian, well before dinosaurs evolved. And the first moth fossils we have look a lot more like a caddisfly than they do like a modern moth or butterfly. Sort of have a longer body and they have jaws instead of a proboscis.
We don't talk too much about animals that were around before the dinosaurs. I think it's usually sharks or things that are in the water, but not something like a fly.
Yeah, that's true. Or a moth.
Mm-hmm.
So back to the new study about why they might need a proboscis and why it evolved when it did. There's a paper by Timo Van Aldijk and others titled A Triassic-Jurassic Window into the Evolution of Lepidoptera. And what they're talking about is that they found fossilized scaled wings from lepidopterans that date back to about 200 million years ago, near the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, probably in the very late Triassic. Unfortunately, in these specimens, it's just the wings. The proboscis isn't preserved, but the wings look to be from the same group of moths that had a proboscis. So the theory here is that The proboscis allowed these early moths to get liquid from more sources when water was scarce in the Triassic, because we've talked about how with Pangaea, there was that big belt of arid land in the middle and lots of extreme climates going on. And so apparently the moths evolved a trick to deal with that, and that was their proboscis. Their proboscis would have allowed them to drink from little droplets, which they couldn't do with their jaws, and also sip from really thin films of water. A couple of examples of that today, which they couldn't really pull off if they didn't have a proboscis, is that they can get water from dung, and they can also drink tears directly from animal eyes.
Oh, I wonder, that must feel weird if you've got the eyes that it's drinking tears from.
Well, we have experienced this because in the Australian outback, that's what flies do.
Oh.
They get all up on your eyes and try to drink the water directly.
Is that
from
what
your
they were
eyeballs.
trying to do?
Yeah, that's what they're doing.
That was weird.
Yes, it's horrible, actually.
Well, you can get used to it, I think.
Yeah, there were a lot of people we encountered that didn't seem to mind the flies drinking from their eyeballs.
And then I felt like I was constantly batting at my face.
Yeah, it's not pleasant. I don't recommend it. Get one of those, if you ever go to the outback, get one of those fly, I don't remember what they call them, but it's basically a veil you put over your head like a beekeeper to keep the flies away. Although usually, I should say, in the case of moths, they're doing the eye drinking trick on sleeping animals and not on animals while they're awake like the flies do. I don't know which one's better.
Depends on the animal and how sensitive they are to something landing on its eye.
But would you rather have a fly drink from your eye while you're awake or a moth drink from your eye while you're asleep?
Well, I wouldn't know if the moth was doing it. I'd be asleep.
Yeah, it's just really creepy to think about. So on a brighter note, once flowered plants evolved, those moths already had proboscises, and that meant they were in good shape for drinking nectar out of flowers.
That seems better than getting water from dung.
It does, yes. The butterflies definitely have it a little better. And that also means that the previous hypothesis that the moths today that have a proboscis evolved from butterflies that have a proboscis for flowers is reversed. Actually, the proboscis evolved from moths about 100 million years before flowering plants were common.
So they were just in a good position to take advantage of what they had.
Yep.
Enjoy those flowering plants.
Yep. You see that over and over again in the story of evolution. There's some really difficult event that forces some change in a group of animals. And then later on, there's an advantage that they can leap on because they went through these hard times and evolved some sort of fancy adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Anytime I hear leap, I think leaping laylaps. I don't know why I think egads, leaping laylaps.
I have no idea.
Egads, look at that butterfly and its proboscis.
And they might have drinking the tears of dinosaurs.
Oh.
Actually, they probably did.
Probably.
Although they had the nictitating membrane and stuff, so maybe they could protect their eye from the... although they drink tears from birds, so maybe not actually. Might not help
Maybe
that
it was
much.
while the dinosaur was asleep.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I thought they closed their nictitating membrane when they slept. It might still be moist, though.
Mm-hmm.
Might be able to get a little tear off the outside of that.
There's always the dung.
Yeah, if push comes to shove.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we will be talking about that promised new dinosaur. And also, if you want to hear more about butterflies, go back to episode 448 in our fun fact. If you like listening to I Know Dino, we'd really appreciate a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks again, and until next time.
You could tell from watching me walk, I'm a dinosaur.